The hospital wing's supply ledger had not been updated since Thursday. Madam Pomfrey noticed this at 20 minutes past 6 in the evening, when she pulled the leather-bound record book from its shelf beside the medicine cabinet and found the last entry dated 3 days prior. A routine notation regarding 2 bottles of Scaligro, consumed during a Quidditch practice incident involving a third-year Hufflepuff and an improperly maintained broom. The entry was complete and accurate. The problem was simply that nothing had been recorded since. She set the ledger on her desk and uncapped her quill. This was not, in itself, unusual. The spring term's final weeks had a tendency to compress time in ways that disrupted administrative regularity. Students arrived with stress-related ailments, headaches, insomnia, the occasional hex from fraying tempers, and the volume of minor cases could push paperwork into the following day, then the day after that. Pomfrey had worked at Hogwarts long enough to recognize the rhythm. She did not find it acceptable, but she recognized it. She began the catch-up entries methodically, working from memory, and the small scratch notes she kept on a separate slip of parchment clipped inside the front cover. 4 students seen on Friday, 2 on Saturday. 1 a repeat case, the same 5th-year boy who had come in 3 times this month with tension headaches she suspected were examination anxiety, presenting somatically. She had given him a mild calming draft on the first visit and recommended he speak with his head of house. He had not done so as far as she could tell, because he had returned. She recorded each visit with the same level of detail: name, house, year, complaint, treatment administered, outcome, discharge time. The medicine cabinet required a full audit. She crossed to it with her ledger open, quill still in hand, and began counting from the top shelf downward. Ditany, adequate. Essence of myrtlap. 3 jars, sufficient for ordinary weekly demand, but not for anything beyond that. Scaligro, 1 full bottle and 1 3/4 depleted. Pain-relieving potion. She paused here. 4 vials. That was low for this point in the term. She made a note with a small asterisk to indicate urgency and continued down. Blood replenishing potion. 2 bottles. She stopped. 2 bottles was not enough. It was not nearly enough for any circumstance she could reasonably anticipate, and Pomfrey had long ago trained herself to anticipate circumstances that most of the castle staff preferred not to consider. She had worked through 2 decades of Hogwarts, through Quidditch seasons and Dada teachers of varying competence, and 1 genuinely catastrophic incident involving a vanishing staircase and 14 students, and she had learned that the supply she thought was adequate was, reliably, the supply she would wish she had more of. She wrote the notation. Blood replenishing potion. 2 bottles. Reorder immediately. The asterisk she placed beside it was larger than the previous one. The house elf arrived 12 minutes after she sent the supply request through the usual channel. A small folded note placed in the brass request tray beside the door, which operated on a charm that alerted the kitchens. The elf's name was Tilly. She had been assigned to the hospital wing supply runs for the past 4 years and was, in Pomfrey's estimation, entirely reliable. Madam Pomfrey is needing the blood replenishing potion, Tilly said, appearing beside the door with the particular noiseless arrival that Pomfrey had long since stopped startling at. Tilly has checked the stores. There is being 6 bottles available from the potion supply. Bring all 6, Pomfrey said, without looking up from her ledger. There was a brief pause. All six, madam. All six, Tilly, yes. Another pause, shorter. Tilly will bring them directly. She did not explain the request. It was not necessary to. Explain supply requests to the house elves, and she had found over the years that explanations invited questions, and questions consumed time that could be spent on other tasks. Tilly had learned across 4 years of working these supply runs that Pomfrey did not overorder. If she asked for 6 bottles, she had a reason. While she waited, Pomfrey continued the audit. Burn healing paste, 1 tin, half full. She made a note. Pepper up potion, adequate. Sleeping draught, 3 bottles, which was more than she typically kept. A remnant of February's anxiety season that had not yet been drawn down. She would not reorder that. Bezoars. She counted them in their small ceramic dish. 7, she counted again. Still 7. That was correct. She moved to the linen shelf. Bandaging rolls. She counted those too. Methodical and unhurried, though something at the back of her mind was moving faster than her hands. She had been in this wing long enough to recognize the particular quality of a castle evening that felt different from an ordinary one. It was not something she could have articulated precisely. The light was the same. The sounds from the corridors had been unremarkable when she last heard them. About an hour ago, distant footsteps, the creak of the staircase settling, the faint echo of voices from somewhere near the east end of the building. But there had been a staff meeting called for early evening, and it had run long. She knew this because Professor Sprout had stopped briefly at the wing's door on her way back from it, and said only that there had been developments and that Pomfrey should be prepared, and then had moved on before Pomfrey could ask a clarifying question. Sprout was not given to vague warnings. The fact that she had delivered one and then left quickly was itself a piece of information. Pomfrey noted the linen count, added 2 rolls to the request list, set the list beside the tray. The portrait on the east wall, a former matron named Eudora Blunt, who had served the wing in the 1880s and had opinions about everything, cleared her throat at 7:15. "There are students being moved," Eudora said. Pomfrey looked up. "Moved where?" "Through the east corridor, toward the staircases. In groups. Some of the prefects are with them." Eudora's painted expression was difficult to read. She had been rendered by an artist who favored restraint, but her posture had shifted in the way it sometimes did when she was relaying something she found significant. "They are not going to dinner." "No," Pomfrey said. "I don't expect they are." She closed the ledger. She set the quill down on the desk with the same care she always used, pressing the nib gently against the rest so it would not bleed onto the wood. Then she stood and began preparing the beds. There were 20 beds in the hospital wing under ordinary circumstances. She had long since negotiated the addition of a storage alcove that could be converted to hold an additional 4 pallets when capacity required it. She had made this arrangement after a particularly difficult Triwizard tournament year, when she had spent 2 nights improvising space and had afterward written a formal request to the headmaster documenting why the alcove conversion ought to be a standing protocol rather than an emergency measure. The request had been approved. The alcove had been converted. She had never once regretted the bureaucratic effort it had taken. She unfolded the first extra pallet now, not because she needed it, but because having it unfolded was faster than unfolding it later. Tilly returned with the 6 bottles of blood replenishing potion. She set them on the supply table without comment, arranged them in a neat row, and looked at Pomfrey with an expression that was carefully neutral. "Will Madam be needing anything else?" Tilly asked. "Extra bandaging, rolls, not the pre-cut, and whatever burn healing paste remains in the general stores." Pomfrey paused, considering. "And pain-relieving potion, as much as is available." Tilly did not pause this time. "Tilly will bring it all." She disappeared. The beds took 20 minutes to prepare properly. Pomfrey worked from one end of the ward to the other, checking each mattress, ensuring the pillow charms were set correctly. The hospital wing's pillows were charmed to adjust firmness based on the patient's positioning, a practical enchantment that had been installed sometime in the 1950s and required a recharm every 18 months, and confirming that each bedside cabinet contained the standard admission kit, a small water carafe, a cloth, and a fresh card for recording patient information. The cards were important. Some of her colleagues found the paperwork aspect of medical care tedious, a view she had never understood. A card correctly filled out told her what the patient had received, when, in what quantity, and what had followed. Without that record, she was treating in the dark. With it, she could work quickly and accurately, even when the ward was full, and she had not slept. She refilled the water carafes from the pitcher charm and moved on. Eudora spoke again from the wall. "I've heard from the corridor portrait, the one near the 4th floor staircase. She says there are people on the grounds." "Students or staff?" Pomfrey asked. "Neither, she thinks." Pomfrey absorbed this without visible reaction. She straightened the last bedside cabinet, aligned the card precisely with the cabinet's corner, and walked back to the supply table to check the arrangement of the bottles Tilly had brought. 6 blood-replenishing potions in a row. She considered them. Then she crossed to the medicine cabinet, opened the lowest shelf, the one she rarely needed, the one that held the heavier intervention supplies, and checked those stores as well. Doxy egg antidote, mandrake restorative draught, 2 bottles sealed, a small wooden box containing the equipment for the ferula charm application, which she used when fractures required temporary splinting before more complete healing could be performed. She checked the ferula kit for completeness. Everything was present. She closed the cabinet. It was 8 o'clock when she heard the first distant sound from outside, not from the corridors, but from somewhere beyond the castle walls, muffled by stone, but present nonetheless. A sharp report, like a crack in the air. Then silence. Then another. She was at her desk, updating the supply ledger with the items Tilly had delivered, entering each bottle and package in the correct column with the date and quantity. She did not stop writing. She completed the current line. Blood replenishing potion, 6 bottles, received May 2nd, 1998. Tilly, kitchen stores, and moved to the next. The sounds did not repeat immediately. She continued writing. Eudora said nothing. The portrait of the former potion's mistress on the opposite wall, who had been silent all evening, turned slightly in her painted chair, a movement too small to mean anything specific, but which Pomfrey noted. She finished the supply entries. She set the ledger to one side, precisely parallel to the desk edge, and folded her hands on the surface for a moment. 20 beds, fully prepared. 4 additional pallets in the alcove, unfolded. Supply table organized by category and access frequency. The most used items at the front, the heavier interventions behind. Records caught up and current. Request list complete. The wing was, as far as it could be, ready. She rose from the desk and walked to the door. She did not open it. She stood at it for a moment, listening. From somewhere below and distant, she could hear, or thought she could hear, the sound of many feet moving through stone corridors. Not the ordinary shuffle and chatter of students changing classes. Something more purposeful, something less orderly. She returned to her desk. She sat down, pulled the ledger back in front of her, and opened it to the admissions page, the page that recorded incoming patients. She dated the top of a fresh entry line, May 2nd, 1998. Then she set her quill ready, and she waited. The first patient arrived at 8:23. Pomfrey recorded the time on the admissions line before she had fully assessed the injury, because the time was the first fact, and facts were recorded in order. The student, a fifth-year Gryffindor girl named Helena Marsh, was walking under her own power, supported on one side by a sixth-year prefect, whose name Pomfrey did not immediately recognize. The girl's left arm was held against her chest at an angle that indicated a fracture, though she was not crying. Her face was pale and composed in the particular way that suggested she had made a decision to remain composed and was concentrating on maintaining it. "Sit here," Pomfrey said, directing her to the nearest bed with a gesture. She turned to the prefect. "What happened?" "A wall came down," the prefect said. "In the corridor near the charms classroom. Part of it. She was caught by the edge." "Anyone else?" "Not that I saw. I came straight here." "Go back," Pomfrey said. "If there are others, send them directly. Don't stop to assess. That's my work, not yours. Just send them." The prefect left. Pomfrey turned to Helena Marsh and began. The fracture was clean. The radius, mid-shaft, not displaced. She confirmed this with a diagnostic charm, passing her wand in a slow, horizontal arc above the arm and reading the faint luminescence that indicated bone structure. Clean fractures were straightforward. She prepared the Skele-Gro dose, a partial dose as the fracture was not severe, and talked while she worked, not warmly, but in the functional, even tone she used during treatment, because silence made students anxious and anxiety complicated healing. "You'll need to keep the arm still for 40 minutes after the potion. Don't attempt to move the fingers before that." "Is it bad?" Helena asked. "It's a fracture. It will be repaired." Pomfrey administered the dose, noted the time on the patient card, and reached for the temporary binding cloth. "Did you see what caused the wall section to collapse?" "There was an explosion," Helena said. "Outside, I think. It shook everything." Pomfrey noted this on the card without comment. She applied the binding, not a full splint, as the Skele-Gro would do the structural work, but enough to prevent incidental movement, and indicated the bed's pillow charm with a small adjustment of her wand so it would support the arm correctly. "Lie back. Don't try to sit up for the first 20 minutes." She returned to her desk and completed the admissions entry. Name, house, year, nature of injury, treatment administered, time of treatment. She noted the cause as reported. Structural damage, corridor near charms, possible external percussive event, and moved the quill to the ready position for the next entry. She did not wait long. The second and third arrivals came together at 8:31. 2 Ravenclaw boys, both 4th years, one supporting the other. The supported one had a gash along his forearm that had bled considerably into his robes, but was, on examination, shallower than it appeared. Lacerations of this type always produced more alarm than their severity warranted. The blood was the problem. It made everyone in the vicinity believe the situation was worse than it was, including, frequently, the patient. "Sit," she said, directing the injured boy to the second bed. She looked at his companion. "Are you hurt?" "No, Madam Pomfrey." "Then you may wait by the door or return to wherever students are being kept. You cannot stay in the ward." The uninjured boy looked briefly uncertain, then nodded and moved toward the door. She was already working on the laceration. Cleaning charm first, then the ditany application, measured carefully because she was conscious of the supply level. The wound closed in stages, the skin drawing together from the outer edges inward, which was how ditany worked when applied correctly. She noted the progress, applied a second pass where the closure was incomplete, and reached for the bandaging. "Hold still," she said. Though he had not moved, she bandaged efficiently. Not quickly for its own sake. Speed without accuracy was counterproductive, but without any motion that did not serve the task. She had been performing this particular type of wound closure for long enough that her hands knew the sequence without instruction from her conscious attention, which was free to consider other things. What it was considering, currently, was the supply table, 2 ditany applications in the first 15 minutes. The jar she had noted as adequate was now 1/3 depleted. She would need to revise her assessment of adequate. She completed the bandaging, recorded the patient, told him to remain for observation for 30 minutes, and crossed to the supply table to move the second ditany jar to the front. Eudora spoke at 8:42. "The portrait near the entrance hall says there is significant movement on the grounds. She can see through the window opposite her frame. She says there are lights." "What kind of lights?" "She describes them as irregular, not torches." Pomfrey was preparing the next bed for use, tucking the corners of the sheet precisely, aligning the patient card blank on the cabinet. And she continued doing so while she processed this. Irregular lights on the grounds, not torches, at this hour, in conjunction with structural damage to the castle's interior. She had enough information to form a working understanding of the situation, though she did not find it productive to dwell on the understanding in detail. The understanding did not change what needed to be done. "Thank you, Eudora," she said. She moved to the next bed. By 9 o'clock, she had admitted 7 patients. The ward was not yet at capacity. 7 beds occupied out of 20, 4 additional pallets still empty in the alcove. But the rate of arrival had been increasing in a way that the early numbers did not fully represent. The first patient had arrived at 8:23. The 7th had arrived at 8:58. That was 7 admissions in 35 minutes, and the interval between arrivals had been shortening with each one. She updated the admissions log, tallied the supply usage in the margin, and did a brief visual survey of the ward. Helena Marsh, bed 1, fracture, healing on schedule. The 2 Ravenclaw boys, beds 2 and 3. She had put them in adjacent beds as a concession to the practical reality that students in distress settled more quickly when near someone they knew. A Hufflepuff second year with a mild concussion, bed 4, who had been found in a corridor and brought up by one of the heads of house. Professor Sprout herself, who had arrived brisk and focused, deposited the student with minimal explanation and left again immediately. A Slytherin 5th year with a dislocated shoulder, now relocated and bound, bed 5. 2 more students with minor injuries, burns, 1 each on the hand and the neck, consistent with proximity to a spell rather than a direct hit, in beds 6 and 7. She had asked each of them, while treating them, what they had seen. Not because she required the information for treatment purposes. The injuries themselves told her what she needed to know medically, but because the patient's accounts collectively constituted a kind of map of what was happening in the castle, and a map was useful. The accounts were fragmented and in some cases contradictory in their details, but taken together, they indicated the following: fighting in or near the castle grounds, structural damage to at least 2 corridors on the lower floors, students being directed to shelter in groups, and a general disruption of the castle's normal operations that had been building throughout the evening. She did not record this synthesis in the admissions log, which was a medical document. She noted it internally and returned to work. At 9:14, a face she recognized arrived. The student was a 7th year. She knew him because she had treated him multiple times across his years at the school, beginning with a particularly memorable first-year incident involving a Wingardium Leviosa exercise gone wrong, and continuing through various Quidditch-related injuries, a poisoning incident in his 6th year that had kept him in the wing for several days, and at least 2 other significant cases she could recall without consulting records. He was walking, which was the first relevant fact. The second relevant fact was that he was supporting his left side with his right arm in a way that indicated something was wrong with the ribs. "Bed 8, she said, before he had spoken. He complied without argument, which told her the pain level was significant. He was not ordinarily compliant. She ran the diagnostic charm. 3 ribs, 2 fractured, and 1 cracked. No pneumothorax. The lung was clear, which was the outcome she had been most concerned about. Rib fractures were painful and incapacitating, but manageable. A punctured lung was a different category of problem. "Breathe normally," she said. "I am breathing normally." "You're breathing shallowly to avoid pain. That's not the same thing." She prepared the pain-relieving potion, a full dose, given the extent of the injury, and a partial measure of the mending solution she used for bone damage, less severe than that requiring scalar grow. "This will reduce the pain within 5 minutes. The bone repair will take longer. You'll need to remain in the ward." "For how long?" "Until I discharge you." She administered the potion and began the wand work for the fractures, the slow, careful passes that encouraged the bone to begin knitting. "How did this happen?" he told her. She listened while she worked, absorbing the information with the same attention she gave all patient reports, neither more nor less, because she could not afford to weight reports differently based on her familiarity with the patient. What he described was more serious than anything the previous 7 patients had conveyed, and more specific. She updated her internal map accordingly. She completed the initial wand work, noted the treatment on his card, and told him to remain still. "I need to go back," he said. You need to remain still, she said. Madam Pomfrey, the rib repair requires 40 minutes of uninterrupted rest for the initial phase to hold. If you move before that, the work I have just done will be significantly less effective, and you will return to me in a worse state than you are currently in. She looked at him directly. 40 minutes, then I will reassess. He was quiet for a moment. Then he lay back. She returned to her desk. She noted the time, 9:21, and wrote it on his card. 40 minutes from 9:21 was 10 o'clock. She would reassess at 10 o'clock. She moved the quill to the ready position. The 8th and 9th patients arrived within 2 minutes of each other, which meant she was treating one while the second waited, and she was aware of the second waiting in a way that was not anxiety, but was a constant low-level presence in her attention. She moved between them in order of severity. The 8th patient, a Gryffindor 3rd year, with a spell burn across the back of her hand and wrist, not serious, but painful, was treated first because she had been waiting longer. The 9th, a staff member, one of the younger teachers, with a gash above the eyebrow that was bleeding freely into his face, was treated second. Sit forward, she told him, tipping his chin slightly to improve her angle of access. Don't touch it. I wasn't. You were about to. She applied the cleaning charm and reached for the ditany. The second jar. She noted the level, just below half now. Head wounds bleed disproportionately. It looks worse than it is. That's comforting, he said, in a tone that did not suggest he found it comforting. It's accurate, she said, which is more useful. She closed the wound, applied a light bandage to protect the area, and told him he could return to whatever he needed to do, but should come back immediately if he experienced dizziness, nausea, or any change in vision. He left. She recorded him in the log and noticed, in doing so, that the admissions page was more than half full. She turned to a fresh page and dated it. By 9:40, there were 14 patients in the ward. She had not sat down since 9 o'clock. She moved between beds with the assessment chart clipped to a board under her arm, checking on the recovering patients in order, updating notations, adjusting doses where the initial calculations required revision. Helena Marsh's fracture was knitting correctly. She would be ready for the Skeely Grow second phase within the hour. The Ravenclaw boy's laceration was holding cleanly. The second year with the concussion was resting, her observations stable, which was the correct outcome for that injury at this stage. At bed 8, she stopped. The 7th year was where she had left him, which was correct. His breathing was more regular than when he had arrived, the pain-relieving potion working as intended. She checked the rib work with a brief diagnostic pass and found the initial phase holding. She noted the time on his card. 19 minutes remaining. She moved on. The supply table, when she passed it, told a story she was already writing in the admissions margin. Ditany, second jar, now 2/3 depleted. Blood replenishing potion. She had not yet needed it, which was fortunate. Pain relieving potion, down to 7 vials from the original 4, plus the reorder. Bandaging rolls, 3 used. She did not stop at the table. She noted the figures and kept moving, because there were 14 patients and the rate of arrival had not slowed. She returned to her desk and sat down for the first time in 40 minutes. She picked up the quill. She had a great deal still to record. The 20th bed filled at 10:17. Pomfrey noted it on the admissions log with the same notational precision she had applied to the first: name, house, year, injury, time. And then she set the quill down, stood, and walked to the alcove. She pulled the first pallet out and positioned it in the space between beds 3 and 4, which was the widest gap in the ward's current arrangement. She unfolded the second pallet and placed it opposite. Then she returned to the supply table, collected 2 patient cards and 2 water carafes, and set them at the head of each pallet. The alcove held 4 pallets. She had now used 2. She returned to the admissions log and wrote in the margin, "Overflow begun, 22:17. Then she resumed treating patients. The supply problem had become concrete at 10 o'clock. Until then, it had been a projection, a calculation she was running continuously in the back of her attention, tracking consumption rates against remaining stock and arriving at estimates she hoped would prove pessimistic. At 10 o'clock, when she reached for the ditany and found the second jar at its last quarter, the projection became a present fact. She set the jar down, assessed its remaining volume, and made a decision. From this point, ditany would be used only for wounds that would not close adequately by other means. Minor lacerations, the kind that were unpleasant and bloody but not structurally significant, would receive the standard cleaning charm and a pressure bandage instead. It was a less elegant solution. It would result in more visible scarring for some patients. But scarring was a cosmetic concern, and this was not a cosmetic situation. She sent a note to the kitchens through the request tray. Ditany, all available stock. Immediately. She went back to work. Tilly arrived at 10:19 with 3 jars of ditany and an expression of careful neutrality that Pomfrey had come to recognize as the house elf equivalent of concern. "This is all the ditany in stores, madam," Tilly said. Tilly has checked the potions cupboard also. Professor's supply is being less than usual. Many things have been used already tonight. The potions classroom has been accessed. Tilly thinks so, madam. The door was unlocked and some items were moved. Pomfrey received this information without comment. Someone, a student, a teacher she could not know, had been into the potion stores already, which meant others had anticipated the same shortages she was managing and had responded before she could coordinate with them. It was not the worst outcome. It simply meant her inventory calculations required adjusting. "Burn healing paste," she said. "Whatever remains in the general stores." "Tilly brought it before," Tilly said. "In the second delivery. It is on the supply table." "I know. I need more." Tilly's expression shifted fractionally. "There is not being more, madam. That was the last." Pomfrey looked at the supply table. The tin of burn healing paste was 3/4 depleted. She had admitted 6 patients with burn injuries across the evening, spell burns ranging from minor to moderate, and the rate of burn cases had been rising in the past hour. She revised her protocol again. Burn healing paste for moderate and severe cases only. Mild burns, redness, minor blistering, intact skin would receive a cooling charm and a protective wrap. It was not the treatment she would choose under ordinary circumstances. It was the treatment she had available. She noted the revision on the protocol list she had begun, keeping on a slip of parchment beside the admissions log. The list now had 4 items on it. She pinned it to the desk surface with a small brass paperweight, so it would not shift when she moved past it quickly. At 10:31, a problem arrived that was not about supplies. The student was a second-year Slytherin, brought in by an older student who had found her in a corridor and could not get a coherent account of what had happened. The girl was conscious and physically uninjured, as far as Pomfrey could determine from an initial assessment. No fractures, no lacerations, no burns, no indication of a direct spell hit. She was sitting on the edge of a pallet with her knees drawn up and her arms wrapped around them, and she was not responding to her name. Pomfrey crouched to the girl's eye level, a posture she used rarely, reserved for cases where the normal standing position created an unhelpful dynamic, and spoke in the same even tone she used for all patients. "You're in the hospital wing. You're not injured. I need you to tell me your name. Nothing. You don't have to speak if you can't. Nod if you can hear me." A very small nod. "Good." Pomfrey straightened, made a note on the patient card. Responsive to instruction, non-verbal. No apparent physical injury, possible acute stress presentation, and considered her options. There were 3 beds occupied by patients who were stable and largely through the active phase of their treatment. She moved the Slytherin girl to the bed nearest the wall, which was the most enclosed position in the ward, and therefore, in her experience, the one that patients in this state found least overwhelming. She had no specific medical protocol for this. The girl needed quiet and time, 2 things the ward could not reliably provide for the next several hours. Pomfrey set a low-level calming charm on the immediate area around the bed, not a potion which required consent she could not adequately obtain, but a charm that reduced the ambient sound reaching the bed, and left a cloth and a water carafe on the cabinet. She noted the time and moved on. There were 3 new arrivals waiting. The portraits had been active throughout the evening, passing information between frames in the relay system that connected the hospital wing to the rest of the castle. Eudora had been providing periodic updates, and Pomfrey had been receiving them in the compressed form they had developed over years of working in proximity. A sentence or 2, no elaboration unless requested, delivered during the brief intervals when Pomfrey was moving between patients rather than treating them. At 10:44, Eudora said, "The portrait near the Great Hall says the hall itself is being used." "Used how?" "She is not certain. She says there are many people inside." Pomfrey considered this while she completed a bandage application on a Hufflepuff 6th year whose left hand had been caught by what appeared to be a blasting curse fragment. The hand was intact, all 5 fingers, the tendons undamaged, which was fortunate, but 3 of the metacarpal bones required wand work that she was currently administering. "If they are using the Great Hall," she said, without stopping the wand movement, "then someone has organized a secondary staging area, which means there will be cases that don't come to me." "Is that a problem?" Eudora asked. "It is a variable," Pomfrey said. "Whether it is a problem depends on what they are doing with the cases." She completed the metacarpal work and noted it. She would send Tilly to the Great Hall within the next 30 minutes with a supply of basic items: bandaging, the pepper-up potion, which he had in relative abundance, and 1 of the blood-replenishing bottles. If a secondary treatment location was operating, it needed to be operating with materials that were adequate. She wrote the instruction on a separate slip and placed it in the request tray. By 11 o'clock, the ward held 26 patients, 20 beds, 4 pallets in use, and 2 patients in chairs near the window. Minor cases that did not require lying down, but whom she had declined to discharge because the castle's corridors were not, currently, a safe place to send recovering students. The chairs were not ideal. She had placed them herself, retrieved from the small anteroom where she kept the administrative overflow, and positioned them against the wall where they would be out of the main thoroughfare. She stood at the supply table and conducted a rapid assessment. It took her 4 minutes. She did not rush it. Ditany, 2.5 jars remaining of the 3 Tilly had brought. Blood replenishing potion, 4 bottles unused, 2 partially used. Pain relieving potion, down to 5 vials. Burn healing paste. The tin was at 1/4. Bandaging. She had used more than she had estimated. The rolls were depleted faster than expected because several of the injuries had required rebandaging after initial dressings became saturated. She had 6 rolls left. She wrote the current figures in the margin of the admissions log. Then she looked at them. The rate of incoming patients had been roughly consistent for the past hour, between 2 and 4 arrivals every 15 minutes. If that rate held through the night, she would exhaust her pain-relieving potion before 2 in the morning. The burn-healing paste would be gone by midnight. She sent another note through the request tray. Tilly arrived in 9 minutes. "There is not being much left in the general stores, madam," Tilly said. Tilly has been checking. The kitchens have some things, but not the medical supplies. The potions classroom, Professor Slughorn's private cabinet. There is a secondary supply there for emergencies. The cabinet is behind the bookshelf on the east wall. The key is kept on a hook inside the top drawer of his desk. Tilly's eyes widened very slightly. "He will be informed," Pomfrey said. "Go." Tilly went. At 11:18, Pomfrey reached bed 8. The 7th-year student had remained where she had placed him, as instructed. His breathing was regular. The diagnostic charm showed the rib repair was in its 2nd phase, progressing correctly. She updated his card. "You said 10 o'clock, he said. "It is now 11:18. "I know. I've been occupied." She completed the notation. "The repair is progressing. You need another 40 minutes. He was quiet for a moment. She could see the effort of it. The stillness that was not restfulness, but constraint. She had seen it many times. Students who needed to be somewhere else lying in beds, counting the minutes. Not because they were impatient, but because they believed the somewhere else needed them. She did not address this directly. It was not her role to arbitrate what the castle needed. Her role was to determine what this patient needed, and this patient needed 40 more minutes of uninterrupted rest. 40 minutes, she repeated. Then I will reassess. She moved on to the next bed. Tilly returned at 11:29 with a box of supplies from Professor Slughorn's cabinet. Pain-relieving potion, a fresh tin of burn-healing paste, and 3 additional rolls of bandaging. Pomfrey received the box, set it on the supply table, and began integrating the new items into the existing arrangement, rotating the older stock forward, placing the new items behind, maintaining the organizational system that allowed her to locate any item within 3 seconds in any condition, including poor lighting and exhaustion. She noted the additions in the margin. The supply problem was not solved. It was extended. There was a difference, and she was clear about which one this was. She picked up the admissions log and updated the running tally. 27 patients, 3 chairs, 4 pallets. The ward was full in every configuration she had prepared for. She looked toward the alcove. There was floor space remaining. Not much, but enough for 2 more pallets if she angled them correctly. She went to get them. The first case she could not immediately fix arrived at 11:41. He was a Hogwarts teacher, not one of the longest-serving staff members, but present long enough that Pomfrey knew his face and his name, and in the way that proximity over years produced certain things about his habits. He was brought in by 2 students who were themselves unhurt, which meant they had come specifically to help him, which meant the injury had occurred in a location where others were present. He was unconscious. The students had carried him between them, each supporting a shoulder, and they had managed the stairs without dropping him, which Pomfrey noted as a practical achievement that had likely made a difference. "Put him on pallet 1, she said, directing them with a gesture. "Carefully. Keep his head level." They placed him as instructed. She was already running the diagnostic charm before they had fully straightened. The charm returned a complex result. She read it methodically, left to right, the way she had been trained to read diagnostic returns, not searching for the worst finding first, which was the instinctive approach and the wrong one, but processing the full picture before drawing conclusions. There was a head injury, significant but not the most serious finding. There were 2 broken bones in the left forearm, which was serious but manageable. The most serious finding was the internal component, a spell impact to the torso that had produced damage she could see in the charm's output, but could not fully characterize without more detailed assessment. She sent the students away. They hesitated. "Go," she said, in a tone that did not allow for hesitation, and they went. She worked quickly and carefully. The head injury required a stabilization charm first, not treatment, stabilization, which was different. Treatment addressed the damage. Stabilization prevented the damage from progressing, while treatment was being prepared and administered. She applied the stabilization charm in 3 passes, checking after each one that the output had shifted in the correct direction, and then moved to the torso. The internal damage was caused by a curse she recognized. She had treated it before, once during a staff incident in her 3rd year at Hogwarts, when a practical demonstration had gone wrong, and the results had ended up in her ward. The treatment protocol was specific and time-sensitive. She retrieved the relevant items from the medicine cabinet. The Mandrake restorative draft was not indicated here, but a different preparation was, one she kept in the lower shelf for precisely these categories of case, and began. 32 minutes. That was how long the initial intervention took. She did not look up from her work during those 32 minutes, except to check the diagnostic output twice, and to note, once, the 3 new patients had arrived and were sitting on the chairs by the window waiting. She registered their presence and returned to the work in front of her, because the work in front of her required complete attention, and the patients by the window were, from what she could see, stable enough to wait. She completed the intervention at 12:13. The teacher's condition had stabilized, not resolved, not healed, but stabilized, which was what she had been working toward. She noted everything on his card in precise detail, because this was the kind of case where precise records were not a formality, but a clinical necessity. If she needed to hand this care to another person, if she were incapacitated, or if he needed transfer, the card had to contain enough information for that person to continue without her. She pinned an additional notation to the card. Do not move without consulting me first. She went to the patients by the window. The second hard case arrived at 12:31 and was, in a different way, more difficult than the first. She was a third-year student, small for her age, brought in by an older girl who had found her in a corridor and could give no account of what had happened other than that she had been alone and had been there for some time. The student was conscious. She was physically injured, a burn on her left shoulder, moderate severity, and a laceration on her right knee. But the injuries were treatable. The difficulty was not the injuries. The difficulty was that the student would not let Pomfrey near her, not in a combative way, not in a way that required management or restraint, in a way that was almost silent, a contraction, a drawing inward, a flinching back when Pomfrey moved toward her with the wand ready. The student was sitting on the edge of pallet 3 with her arms around herself, the same posture as the second-year Slytherin from earlier, and her eyes were moving around the ward in a way that Pomfrey recognized as hypervigilance, without being able to name it as such in the record. She put the wand away. She pulled the chair from the nearest bedside cabinet and sat down on it, which put her below the student's eye level rather than above it. She had used this approach before and found it change the geometry of the situation in useful ways. My name is Madam Pomfrey, she said. You've been here before. Not this year, I think. But you know where you are. A very slight relaxation in the student's shoulders. I can see you have a burn on your shoulder and a cut on your knee. I'm going to need to treat those, but I'm not going to do anything until you tell me it's all right to start. You can take as much time as you need to tell me that. The ward was not quiet. There were 29 other patients in various states of recovery, and the sounds of the castle were continuing to move through the walls. But in the immediate vicinity of pallet 3, the low-level sound charm she had applied earlier was doing its work. The student looked at her for a long moment. My shoulder hurts, she said. It was barely audible. I know, Pomfrey said. I'm going to fix that. May I start? A nod. She worked slowly, which was not her natural pace and required a conscious adjustment. She narrated each step briefly before performing it. I'm going to clean the burn first. You'll feel a cool sensation. Not because the narration was medically necessary, but because it was functionally useful. Because this patient needed to know what was coming before it arrived. The burn treatment took longer than it should have. She did not show that she noticed this. When she had finished, burn treated, laceration closed, both bandaged correctly, she sat back on the chair rather than rising immediately. You're going to stay here for a while, she said. The bed behind you is empty. You can lie down if you want to, or you can stay sitting. Either is fine. The student looked at the bed. Then she shifted and lay down with the careful movement of someone who was not certain the permission was real. Pomfrey stood, collected the used materials, and noted the case on the card. Under the treatment record, she wrote, in small precise letters, approach modified, full record on separate sheet. she would write the fuller note later. Right now, there were other patients, and the separate sheet would have to wait. She moved on. At 1 o'clock in the morning, Pomfrey stood at the supply table and conducted the third assessment of the night. The pain-relieving potion from Professor Slughorn's cabinet had been absorbed into the ward's consumption within the hour. She had 4 vials left. The burn-healing paste was gone, the last of it used 11 minutes ago on a moderate case she could not in good conscience treat with a cooling charm alone. The ditany was holding because she had maintained the modified protocol strictly. She had 2 jars remaining, and she believed she could make them last until morning if the rate of burn cases did not increase significantly. The blood replenishing potion she had not yet touched. 5 full bottles and 1 partial remained. This was, she understood, the reserve she was least willing to deplete, because it was the reserve she would need most if the cases became more severe. She looked at the ward. 31 patients. She had discharged 3, 2 whose injuries were fully resolved, and 1, the 7th year with the rib fractures, whom she had reassessed at 11:58 and determined was stable enough to discharge with strict instructions that he was to return immediately if he experienced any change in breathing or pain level. She had looked at him for a moment before saying this and added that the instructions were not a formality and that she would know if they were disregarded, which was not entirely true, but was, she found, an effective statement. He had nodded and left without argument. The 31 remaining patients ranged from nearly ready for discharge to the teacher on pallet 1, who would not be moved until morning at the earliest. She did rounds methodically, beginning from bed 1 and working to the end of the ward, then to the pallets, and then to the chairs. Each patient received a diagnostic check and a notation update. The checks were brief, 30 seconds to 2 minutes depending on the case, but collectively they took 40 minutes. It was 1:42 when she returned to her desk. She sat down. She placed her hands flat on the surface of the desk for a moment, palms down. This was something she did rarely and in private. It was not a gesture she would have described as rest, because she was not resting, but it was a pause that served a similar function. The desk surface was cool and solid, and it was, at present, one of the most stable things in the building. Eudora said, from the wall, "Are you all right, Poppy?" The use of her first name, Eudora, used it occasionally in moments she apparently judged to warrant it, landed without particular effect. "I'm occupied," Pomfrey said. She lifted her hands and reached for the admissions log. "That's not what I asked. It's what I have time to answer." She opened the log and continued working. The third hard case was not a single patient. It was a group. They arrived at 2 o'clock, 5 students together, all from what she could determine 7th years or close to it. Brought in by one of the prefects who'd been running between the ward and the rest of the castle all evening, in what appeared to be a self-assigned capacity that no one had officially sanctioned, and Pomfrey had found entirely useful. The injuries across the 5 were varied, 1 serious, 3 moderate, 1 minor, and she triaged them in the time it took them to cross the ward to the available spaces. The serious case went to pallet 2. She treated him first. It was a curse injury. She could identify the class of curse from the presentation, even when she did not know the specific incantation used, the way a physician might identify a category of illness from symptoms without having witnessed the specific exposure. This one had affected the nervous system. The student was conscious and able to speak, but his hands were shaking in a way that was not fear or cold, and the diagnostic charm showed the disruption clearly. This was a case she could treat, but not quickly and not completely tonight. She could stabilize. She could reduce the severity. The full resolution would take days, the kind of gradual work that required the patient to be still and monitored and treated in sessions rather than in a single intervention. She told him this plainly while she administered the first stabilizing treatment. "What does that mean for—" he began. "It means that tonight I will make you more comfortable and prevent this from getting worse," she said. "The rest we will address when the rest can be addressed." He accepted this. She noted it, the acceptance, the way he simply nodded and settled, as something she had not expected and was, in this particular moment, grateful for. She did not record that in the notes. She moved through the other four, the moderate cases, the minor case. The ward absorbed them. At 2:26, she updated the total. 36 patients. She looked at the 4 empty pallets she had kept in reserve against the wall. She went to get 2 more. At 3 o'clock, the castle shook. Not the minor structural tremors that had been occurring intermittently since 8 in the evening, the kind that sent small vibrations through the stone floors and produced a faint rattling from the medicine cabinet's glass jars. This was different in scale. The ward's windows flexed in their frames. One of the water carafes on a bedside cabinet toppled, and Pomfrey caught it without thinking, her hand moving before her. Attention had fully registered the motion. Several patients woke who had been sleeping. One of the chairs by the window scraped 2 inches across the floor. She set the carafe upright. She looked at the ward. "Stay where you are," she said, to the room generally. Her voice was level and carried without being raised. "The building is sound. Remain in your beds." Most of them did. 2 sat up. She crossed to the nearer one, a Ravenclaw 4th year who had been admitted with a moderate curse injury and had been sleeping for the past hour, and placed a hand briefly on his shoulder, a firm downward pressure that communicated the instruction more efficiently than repeating it aloud. He lay back. She checked the medicine cabinet. 2 jars had shifted on the upper shelf. She repositioned them and verified the remaining ditany was secure. The jars had cork stoppers and the corks were still seated. She checked the supply table. Nothing had fallen. She returned to her desk and noted the time, 3:04. Significant structural event, ward integrity maintained, no supply disruption, patients resettled. Then she picked up her wand and did a quiet structural charm on the window frames, a reinforcing pass she had learned not from any formal training, but from 30 years of working in a building that was, by its nature, subject to unusual stresses. The charm would not prevent damage from a direct impact. It would help with lateral stress. It was the kind of small, preventive measure that took 40 seconds and was worth doing. She completed it and went back to rounds. Between 3 and 4 o'clock, the arrivals slowed. Not stopped. She admitted 4 patients in that hour, which was fewer than any comparable hour since 8 in the evening. She did not interpret this as improvement. She had been in enough difficult situations to understand that a reduction in arrivals could mean many things, and only some of them were good. What she knew was that the ward had 39 patients, that her supplies were at their lowest point of the night, and that the hours before dawn were the hours in which human endurance, her own and her patients', was at its least reliable. She used the relative lull to do two things. The first was a full supply assessment, the fourth of the night and the most detailed. She wrote the figures in a column in the admissions log margin with the timestamp beside each one. Pain-relieving potion, 2 vials. This was the figure she found most concerning. 2 vials across 39 patients, some of whom would need redosing before morning. She had been rationing it for the past 2 hours, extending intervals, substituting the cooling charm where the pain was tolerable. But 2 vials was below the threshold she could work with comfortably. Burn healing paste, none. Ditany, 1 jar and a fraction. Blood replenishing potion, 4 full bottles, 1 partial. Bandaging, 4 rolls. She looked at the sum, figures for a moment. Then she drew a line under them and wrote a reorder list for morning. It was a long list. She wrote it anyway, because having it written was useful, and because the act of writing it was a statement that morning would come and the reorder would be placed. The second thing she did was assign the student. He had arrived at 11 o'clock, a second-year Hufflepuff boy with a minor injury that had been fully resolved by midnight. She had kept him in the ward because discharging him into the castle at midnight had not been a reasonable option, and because she had noticed while treating him that he was calm in a way that was not shock or dissociation, but simply temperament. He had watched her work with the focused attention of someone who found process interesting rather than frightening. She found him sitting on the edge of his bed, fully awake, watching the ward. "You're not sleeping," she said. "No, Madam Pomfrey." "Can you?" A pause. "I don't think so." She handed him a folded cloth and a water pitcher. "The patients on pallets 1 through 4 check their water carafes every 30 minutes. If a carafe is empty, refill it from the pitcher. Don't speak to the patients unless they speak to you first. Don't touch any of the medical supplies. If any patient appears to be in distress, not restless, not having a bad dream, but genuinely in distress, come and find me immediately. Can you do that?" He looked at the cloth and the pitcher. "Yes." "Your name?" Daniel Abbott." She noted it. "The 30-minute interval is important. Use the clock on the wall, not your own estimate." He looked at the clock, oriented himself to it, and slid off the bed. She watched him begin his first circuit, careful, quiet, not touching anything he had not been told to touch, and return to her desk. It was a small adjustment to the ward's operation. It freed approximately 4 minutes of her attention per hour that she had been using on the pallet patient's water carafes. 4 minutes per hour across what remained of the night was not an insignificant amount. At 3:47, the Slytherin's second year in the bed near the wall, the one who had arrived non-verbal at 10:31, spoke for the first time. Pomfrey was passing the bed on a routine check, and the girl said very quietly, "Is it over?" Pomfrey stopped. She completed the diagnostic pass on the girl's chart first, a brief check, the results unchanged, which was expected. And then she looked at her directly. "I don't know," she said. It was the accurate answer. She did not know. Eudora's updates had become less frequent in the past hour, which could indicate that the portrait network was seeing less activity, or that Eudora had made a judgment that the updates were not serving a useful function at this point. Either interpretation was possible. The girl absorbed the answer without visible distress. Pomfrey found this notable. Not the absence of distress exactly, but the acceptance of an uncertain answer without requiring it to be modified into something more reassuring. "Are you in any pain?" Pomfrey asked. "No." "Are you hungry?" A pause, as though the question required checking. "Yes." Pomfrey went to the anteroom, where she kept a small supplementary supply of the plain food items the kitchen sent up for patients who needed to eat outside of meal hours. Plain biscuits, dried fruit, the occasional small parcel of bread. She brought back a portion and set it on the bedside cabinet. "Eat slowly," she said. "You haven't eaten in some time, probably. Eating quickly won't help." She moved on before the girl could respond, because there were other patients to check and the instruction had been given. But she noted the exchange on the patient card. Patient verbal at 3:47, oriented, no pain reported, eating, because it was medically relevant and because it was relative to the state in which the patient had arrived, a significant change. At 4:15, Daniel Abbott came to find her. She was at the supply table reconsidering the ditany allocation when he appeared at her elbow, correctly silent until she looked at him. "Pallet 1, he said. "I think he's in distress." She was at pallet 1 in 12 seconds. The teacher, the one she had spent 32 minutes stabilizing at 11:41, had shifted during sleep in a way that had partially disrupted the positioning she had set for him. It was not a crisis. The stabilization charm was holding, but the disruption had produced a pain response that was moving him toward waking, and waking in his current condition without preparation would cause a level of acute disorientation that would be counterproductive to his recovery. She administered a careful sedation charm, light, targeted, just enough to maintain the sleep state, and repositioned him with slow, deliberate movements. She reset the diagnostic monitoring. She checked the card. Everything was within the parameters she had established. She looked at Daniel Abbott, who was standing at a correct distance, not hovering. "Good," she said. "Continue your rounds." He returned to the circuit. She noted the intervention on the card and the time. 4:17. Position disruption. Corrective sedation administered. Monitoring reset. And went back to the supply table. The ward at 4:30 had the particular quality she associated with the deepest part of the night. Not silence, because 39 patients in various states of recovery produced a continuous low-level sound of breathing and shifting and the occasional murmur, but a reduction in the quality of alertness that was different from sleep. The castle's sounds from outside had changed too. The sharp, irregular reports that had been occurring throughout the night were less frequent. There had not been a major structural tremor since 3 o'clock. She did not interpret this. She noted it, Eudora said, at 4:41. "It's quieter outside." "I can tell," Pomfrey said. "The portrait near the east tower says she can see the grounds more clearly now. She thinks—" Eudora paused in a way that was unusual for her. "She is not certain what she thinks. Tell her to keep watching and report what she sees, not what she thinks." I'll pass that along. Pomfrey completed the current chart notation and moved to the next bed. At 5 o'clock, she made the pain-relieving potion last. There was one vial remaining. She had administered the other at 4:30 to a patient whose pain level had reached the threshold where the substitution approaches were no longer adequate. One vial. She looked at it for a moment on the supply table and then made a decision that was not comfortable, but was correct. She would hold it in reserve for a case that required it with no available alternative, and every other patient would receive the best non-potion management she could provide. She went through the ward and assessed each patient for pain level, working from the most serious cases forward. For the majority, the interventions she had already performed had progressed to a stage where pain was manageable. 3 patients required additional measures. She administered what she had, adjusted charm work, positioning changes, the distraction technique of giving patients something simple to focus on that she had developed not from any textbook, but from decades of managing a ward without enough supplies, which was, she had come to understand, simply the baseline condition of medical work. The teacher on pallet 1 was stable. The third-year girl from earlier was sleeping. The fifth-year Slytherin with the nervous system disruption was awake and watching the ceiling, and had been doing so as far as she could determine for most of the night. She stopped at his pallet. "Are you in pain?" she asked. "The shaking is less," he said. "Is that good?" She checked the diagnostic output. The reduction in tremor was consistent with the stabilization treatment working as intended. "It means the treatment is progressing," she said. "That is the correct direction." He nodded at the ceiling. She noted the diagnostic result and moved on. Daniel Abbott completed his final water round at 5:20 and returned to his bed, sat on the edge of it, and was asleep within 4 minutes. Pomfrey noted this without waking him. His task had been assigned for the night, and the night was, in practical terms, resolving. She would manage the remaining rounds herself. She took the cloth and the water pitcher from beside his bed and set them on the supply table. She looked at the ward. 39 patients. The ward was full in every configuration. Beds, pallets, chairs, 2 additional floor-level arrangements she had constructed at 2:30 from folded blankets when the last pallet had been used. The supply table held 1 vial of pain-relieving potion, 1 jar and a fraction of ditany, 4 bottles and 1 partial of blood-replenishing potion, and 4 rolls of bandaging. The burn-healing paste tin was empty. She had turned it upside down to indicate this clearly and had not put it away, because putting away an empty tin suggested the situation was resolved, and it was not. Outside, the sounds had not resumed. She returned to her desk. She opened the admissions log to the current page and read through the entries from the beginning of the night, not because she needed to review them, but because reviewing them was part of her closing process. The same way she had opened with the ledger and the supply audit, she would close with a full read-through, checking for gaps or inconsistencies before the record was complete. She read steadily, 1 entry at a time, her finger moving along the lines. The ward was quiet around her. Dawn was approximately 1 hour away. The last sound from outside the castle came at 5:43. It was not an explosion or a structural impact. It was something lower and less defined, a resonance that passed through the stone walls and the floor and the beds and the bodies of 39 patients, most of whom were sleeping, in a way that Pomfrey felt in her feet before she heard it with any clarity. It lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then it stopped. She was at her desk, midway through the admissions log review. She looked up at the windows. The glass was still. The water in the nearest carafe had moved slightly. A faint circular disturbance on the surface, already settling. She looked at Eudora. Eudora was looking at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Pomfrey returned to the log and found her place and continued reading. The silence that followed was different from the silences that had occurred throughout the night. During the night, silence had been intermittent. Intervals between structural sounds, between arrivals, between the castle's irregular percussion. Those silences had a provisional quality. They ended. This one did not end. It continued through 5:43 and 5:50 and 6 o'clock. And by 6 o'clock, it had become a condition rather than an interval, something the ward existed inside of rather than waited through. Pomfrey noticed it the way she noticed most things, accurately and without embellishment. She completed the log review at 6:12. She had found 2 notational gaps: a patient card from the early rush whose treatment time had been recorded, but whose diagnostic results had not been transferred to the main log, and a supply notation from the 1 o'clock assessment where she had written the blood-replenishing figures in the wrong column and needed to draw an arrow and correct the placement. She made both corrections with the same unhurried precision she applied to everything in the log. The corrections were minor. The record needed to be complete. She closed the log. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap, which was not a position she often occupied at the desk. Usually her hands were occupied. There was, for the first time since 8:23 the previous evening, nothing immediately requiring them. She stood and began morning rounds. The rounds at this hour were different in character from the treatment rounds of the night. Those had been responsive. She had moved through the ward reacting to conditions, adjusting to new arrivals, managing the continuous intake of cases at varying stages of severity. These rounds were accessorial. She was not responding to anything. She was establishing the current state of each patient, updating each record, and making the preliminary determinations about the day ahead. She began at bed 1. Helena Marsh, the Gryffindor 5th year with the radial fracture, was sleeping. The fracture repair was complete. The diagnostic charm confirmed full structural integrity, the bone correctly knitted, no residual displacement. She would be ready for discharge when she woke, with a standard follow-up instruction to avoid load-bearing use of the arm for 48 hours. Pomfrey noted the discharge recommendation on the card and moved on. Beds 2 and 3. The Ravenclaw boys. The laceration on the first was fully healed, the skin intact, no sign of inflammation. He could be discharged. His companion had been discharged hours ago, she recalled. She had cleared him around midnight and forgotten to feel satisfied about it because there had been no opportunity for that kind of notation. She updated the record. Bed 4. The Hufflepuff 2nd year, the concussion case. Pomfrey ran the diagnostic carefully on this one. Concussions required more conservative assessment than structural injuries. The presentation at discharge needed to meet a higher threshold before she was willing to sign off. The result was acceptable, orientation intact, No indication of pressure change, the sleep having been genuinely restorative rather than the dangerous kind. She wrote pending discharge assessment on waking on the card. She worked through the beds in sequence. The ward's composition at this hour was a record of the night's progression. The earlier admissions in the lower numbered beds, the later ones filling the pallets, and the improvised arrangements at the far end. She could read the night in the geography of the ward, the way she could read any document if she understood its organizational logic. At bed 8, she stopped. The bed was empty. She had discharged the 7th-year student at 11:58. She remembered this clearly, and the bed had since been used twice more for 2 later arrivals, both of whom she had subsequently discharged. The bed was remade, or approximately remade. She had stripped and reset it herself during the brief interval around 3:30, when the admission rate had slowed, because remade beds were a functional necessity and not a cosmetic one. A bed that was not ready could not receive a patient, and a bed that could not receive a patient was a reduction in capacity she could not afford. She had remade it. She had remade all the vacated beds throughout the night, in the gaps between arrivals and treatments, sometimes still damp from the cleaning charm, tucking the corners with the same precision she used when the ward was empty and there was time to do it properly. She moved on. Eudora spoke at 6:29. The portrait near the entrance hall. She says people are coming in from the grounds. Pomfrey was at pallet 1, checking the teacher's overnight diagnostics, and she did not look up. How many? She cannot count them from her position. She says they are coming in through the main doors. Some are being helped. Staff or students? Both, she thinks. Pomfrey completed the diagnostic assessment. The teacher's condition was stable. The internal damage repair progressing at the lower end of the expected range, but within it, no deterioration overnight, and noted the results on his card. Then she straightened and looked at the ward. She had 4 empty beds. 2 of the pallets were occupied only by patients who were on preliminary assessment, close to ready for discharge. She would confirm that within the hour. The chairs held patients who were recovering but not yet cleared. The floor-level arrangements at the far end contained 2 patients who would need to be moved to proper beds as soon as those became available. She went to the supply table and reviewed what she had. 1 vial of pain-relieving potion, 1 jar and a fraction of ditany, 4 bottles and 1 partial of blood-replenishing potion, 4 bandaging rolls, no burn-healing paste. She noted all of it on a fresh supply request and placed it in the brass tray. If Tilly was still available, if any of the house elves were operating normally, the request would reach the kitchens. She did not know what the kitchens currently had available. She did not know what any part of the castle outside this room currently had available. She wrote the request anyway, completely and specifically, because that was the procedure, and the procedure was not suspended. Then she went to prepare the empty beds for the cases that were coming. The first person to arrive after the silence was not a student. It was Professor McGonagall. She came through the ward doors at 6:41, walking without assistance, though Pomfrey's immediate assessment, performed in the 2 seconds between the doors opening and McGonagall reaching the center of the ward, noted a stiffness in the left side of her carriage that was not her ordinary posture. She was dressed as she had been the previous evening, which meant she had not slept. Neither, of course, had Pomfrey. That was not relevant. "How many do you have?" McGonagall said, looking at the ward. 39 as of the last count. Several are close to discharge. I'm expecting more from what I'm hearing about the grounds. McGonagall's eyes moved across the ward in a single comprehensive pass. The Great Hall has been used throughout the night. There are people there who will need your attention. I know. Pomfrey had known since 10:44 when Eudora had reported it. I'll need to know what treatments have already been administered. If anyone has given potions or performed healing spells, I need the specifics before I see those patients. I'll find out what I can. I also need supplies. The full list is in the request tray. Whatever the kitchens can't provide, I'll need sourced from elsewhere. The potions classroom has already been accessed. I'll need an accounting of what was taken and by whom. McGonagall looked at her directly. I'll see to it. And I'll need the ward cleared of anyone who can be safely discharged before the new arrivals begin coming in. I'd rather do those assessments now than try to manage them alongside incoming cases. I'll send someone to help move patients who can walk. Not students, Pomfrey said. Not injured ones. Understood. McGonagall paused at the door. Is there anything else immediately necessary? Pomfrey considered the ward. The teacher on pallet 1. He'll need monitoring through the day. I'll brief whoever is available on the parameters. He shouldn't be moved without my assessment first. McGonagall nodded. I'll be back within the hour. She left. Pomfrey noted the conversation. Not in the admissions log, which was a patient document, but on a separate administrative sheet she pulled from the desk drawer. 6:41. McGonagall, initial coordination. Great Hall patients incoming. Supply request escalated. Discharge process to begin. She pinned it beside the protocol list. At 7 o'clock, she began discharges. She worked from the most straightforward cases first. The patients whose diagnostic results were unambiguous, whose treatments were complete, whose instructions were simple, enough to convey in under 2 minutes. Helena Marsh, bed 1, discharged at 7:04 with written instructions regarding arm use, a note to visit her head of house on waking, and a return appointment notation for 48 hours hence. The Ravenclaw boy, bed 2, discharged at 7:08. 3 more in the following 20 minutes, each one cleared by the same process: diagnostic confirmation, card completion, verbal and written instructions, notation in the discharge column of the admissions log. Daniel Abbott, still sleeping on his bed. She left until last. His discharge was straightforward. His injury had resolved hours ago. But she had a use for him for one more task, and she would ask him before he left rather than wake him now for no urgent reason. By 7:30, she had discharged 9 patients and freed 9 beds. She stripped each vacated bed herself, because the house elves had not yet responded to the supply request, and she did not know their current status. She remade each one, working methodically, the same way she had done it throughout the night. Clean sheet, pillow charm confirmed, patient card replaced with a fresh blank, water carafe refilled. Eudora watched from the wall. You've been doing that all night, Eudora said. The beds need to be ready. Yes, Eudora said. I know. Pomfrey finished the last corner, set the fresh card on the cabinet, and moved to the next bed. At 7:41, Tilly arrived. She appeared beside the supply table with a crate that she set down with both arms, which indicated its weight. Her expression was the careful neutrality Pomfrey had come to read as having seen things she was not going to describe, unless asked. "Tilly has brought what she could find," Tilly said. "The kitchens are. There has been some disruption, but Tilly has found most of what was on the list." Pomfrey looked in the crate. Pain-relieving potion, 4 vials. Ditany, 2 jars. Burn-healing paste. 1 tin, which was less than she wanted, but more than she had. Bandaging, 6 rolls. No additional blood-replenishing potion, which was the item she had most wanted and did not say so. "The blood-replenishing potion," she said. "Tilly could not find more. The stores have been used, madam. Tilly thinks others have been taking from them. Many people in many places." Pomfrey received this. "You've done well, Tilly. Thank you." Tilly's expression shifted. A small change, barely perceptible. "Tilly is glad to help, madam." She disappeared. Pomfrey began integrating the new supplies into the table's arrangement, rotating old stock forward, placing new items behind, maintaining the organizational system. The crate's contents, added to what remained, produced a supply state that was insufficient for a normal week, but workable for a controlled day with manageable intake. She noted the updated figures on the administrative sheet. Then she checked the admissions log. The first new arrival from the grounds came through the doors at 7:53, then another at 7:57, then 2 together at 8 o'clock. She was ready for them. She was treating the 8 o'clock arrivals, a straightforward bilateral assessment, 2 students with moderate injuries that required her full attention but not her full supply resources. When Daniel Abbott appeared at her elbow, he had woken on his own and had, evidently, oriented himself to the ward's current state before approaching her, because he did not look disoriented or uncertain. "Do you need more help?" he said. She was in the middle of a 1 pass and completed it before responding. "There are 3 patients near discharge in the far beds," she said. "Their patient cards are on the cabinets. Don't touch the cards. Just check if their water carafes need refilling and come back and tell me. Don't speak to them about their conditions." He went. She completed the assessment on the 8 o'clock arrivals, recorded both cases, and was updating the supply log when he returned. 2 carafes empty, he said. Bed 17 and pallet 3. "Refill them." She indicated the pitcher. He took it and went back. She watched him for a moment. The careful walk, the correct angle of the pitcher when he poured, the small nod he gave to the patient in bed 17 that was exactly within the scope of what she had asked, and no further. Then she returned to her work. At 8:14, the admissions log reached its final page. She turned to the back cover and opened the inside flap, which contained 2 blank continuation sheets, folded flat. She had kept them there for years, on the principle that running out of recording space in the middle of a period of high intake was an administrative failure she could prevent with minimal effort. She unfolded the first sheet, dated the top, and wrote the current patient number, 41, in the upper margin. She looked at the sheet. It was blank and white, and the lines were straight. Outside, through the ward's windows, the sky had moved through the grey of pre-dawn and was now a pale and unremarkable blue. The light falling across the ward floor was early morning light, thin and flat, without the quality of warmth that it would have later in the day. It was the kind of light that made everything look like what it was: stone, linen, wood, glass, without any additional information. She set the continuation sheet flat on the desk, aligned it with the desk edge, and picked up her quill. The ward held 41 patients. 9 had been discharged. New arrivals were coming in from the grounds at a manageable rate. Her supplies were limited, but adequate for current intake. The teacher on pallet 1 was stable. The Slytherin, second year in the bed near the wall, had eaten and was sleeping. Daniel Abbott was refilling water carafes. Eudora said, at 8:19, "I believe it's over." Pomfrey wrote the next admissions entry. Name, house, year, time, injury, a clean line of facts, and did not look up. "Yes," she said. "I expect it is." She completed the entry. She moved to the next line. At 9 o'clock, Pomfrey closed the admissions log. Not permanently. It would be reopened within the hour when the next discharge was processed, and it would remain in active use for days before this particular volume of cases was resolved. But she closed it for the moment because the immediate intake had stabilized, because the ward was operating at a level she could manage without continuous documentation, and because the log had been open since 8 o'clock the previous evening, and closing it, briefly, was a procedural acknowledgement that one phase had ended and another had begun. She set it to the side of the desk, parallel to the edge. Then she pulled the administrative sheet towards her, the one she had started at 6:41 during McGonagall's visit, and began the list of tasks that constituted the day's first order of business. Discharge assessments, supply reorder, full and formal, to replace the night's improvised requests with a proper requisition through the correct channels, a briefing note on the teacher in pallet 1 for whoever would be assisting his ongoing care, a record of the potions classroom access. She needed that accounting before the day was out, both for her own supply records and for whoever would need to reconcile the school's stores after everything had settled. She wrote each item on the list with a short line beside it for completion notation. 7 items total. She underlined the supply reorder because it was the one most likely to be delayed by the castle's current state, and therefore required active follow-up rather than passive expectation. She pinned the list to the desk surface. The discharge assessments took 2 hours. She worked through them in the same order she had used for everything else. Methodical, beginning with the patients closest to full clearance and moving toward those requiring more evaluation. Each assessment followed the same structure: diagnostic charm, comparison against the admissions record, verbal check with the patient, written discharge instructions, notation in the log. 14 patients were discharged between 9 o'clock and 11. Each one left with a card. A small folded card she printed from the standard template, which listed their specific follow-up instructions, the date and time of any return assessment she had scheduled, and the conditions under which they should seek immediate readmission. She had printed these cards in bulk years ago, after a period in which she had observed that verbal instructions given to post-treatment patients were recalled with less accuracy than written ones, particularly in students, and particularly after stressful events. The cards cost her approximately 90 seconds per patient to complete. She considered this a sound allocation. The Hufflepuff, second year with the concussion, bed 4, was discharged at 9:27. Pomfrey gave her the card, reviewed its contents with her verbally, and watched her fold it into her robe pocket. "If you have a headache that doesn't resolve in 48 hours, you come back," Pomfrey said. "Yes, Madam Pomfrey." "Not in 49 hours, in 48. The girl nodded seriously and left. Daniel Abbott was the 11th discharge. Before she processed his card, she said, "You were useful last night." He received this without visible surprise, which suggested he had been expecting some form of assessment rather than none. "I didn't do very much." "You did what you were asked, correctly, for several hours, without requiring supervision." She wrote the completion notation on his card. "That is not nothing." She handed him the card. His instructions were minimal, his injury long resolved. And he looked at it briefly, and then at her. "Will everyone be all right?" he said. Was the kind of question she was asked regularly and had answered in many ways across many years. She considered the ward as it currently stood. 27 remaining patients. The teacher on pallet 1, the 5th year with the nervous system disruption who was progressing correctly, the 3rd year girl who was sleeping with a steadiness that suggested genuine rest rather than exhaustion. "The ones in this ward will receive correct treatment," she said. "That is what I can tell you." He nodded. It was not the answer he had been looking for, but it was the accurate one, and he seemed to understand the distinction. He left. She noted his discharge in the log. At 10:30, she wrote the briefing note for the teacher on pallet 1. It was 3 pages, which was longer than a standard briefing note, but appropriate for the complexity of the case. She wrote it in the same hand she used for patient records, clear, unadorned, structured in sections. Current condition, treatment, administered, with times and dosages, projected recovery timeline, with the range of outcomes clearly stated rather than optimistically compressed. Monitoring parameters, the specific diagnostic indicators that required immediate intervention versus those that indicated normal recovery progression. Contraindications, follow-up schedule. She read it through once, corrected 2 phrasings that were less precise than they should be, and placed it in the folder she kept for complex case notes. Then she sat with the folder for a moment. The teacher had arrived unconscious, brought by students who had managed stairs with him between them. He was now stable, breathing without assistance, and showing diagnostic results that were within the projected range for his treatment. He was not recovered. He would not be recovered for days, possibly longer. But he was on the correct side of a line that, when he had arrived at 11:41 the previous evening, she had not been entirely certain he would reach. She filed the note and moved on. The formal supply reorder took 40 minutes. She worked from the night's margin notations, the figures she had recorded throughout the intake period, and constructed a complete accounting of what had been consumed, what had been sourced through improvised means, and what the wing now held versus what it required. She noted the potion's classroom access separately and flagged it for reconciliation. She noted the items that had run to 0. Burn healing paste, pain relieving potion at its lowest point, and added a quantity increase recommendation for each, with a brief notation explaining the basis for the increase. The recommendation for blood replenishing potion. She increased by the largest margin. She had gone into the night with 2 bottles and ended it with 4 unused. The 4 bottles had felt insufficient throughout the night. The fact that she had not needed to use them was not a reason to maintain the same stock level. It was, if anything, a reason to examine why she had felt the insufficiency so acutely and adjust accordingly. She completed the reorder form, signed it, and placed it in the outgoing correspondence tray, the formal one beside the door, not the brass request tray for immediate kitchen runs. This form would go through proper channels when proper channels were operating again. She did not know when that would be. She placed it there regardless. At 11:40, she did the final bed check of the morning. The ward had 23 patients remaining. Some were sleeping. Several were awake and demonstrably improved. She could tell by the quality of their stillness, which was voluntary, rather than the stillness of someone who could not move comfortably. The third-year girl was awake, sitting up, eating from the small food parcel Pomfrey had placed on her cabinet without comment that morning. The Slytherin second year had been awake for 2 hours and had asked at 9:15 whether she could have something to read. Pomfrey had given her a pamphlet on post-spell recovery protocols, which was the only printed material in the ward, and had found her still reading it attentively 40 minutes later. She did not remark on this. At Pallet 1, she ran the full diagnostic and compared the output to the 6 o'clock assessment. The progression was consistent. She updated the card, checked the monitoring charm, confirmed the briefing note was complete and accessible. Nothing required adjustment. She moved through the remaining beds in sequence, completing each notation, scheduling the afternoon discharge assessments for the patients who would be ready by then. The ward's population would reduce further by evening. By tomorrow, it would begin to resemble, in its numbers, if not entirely in its composition, a normal configuration. She returned to her desk. The admissions log, when she opened it to complete the morning's final notation, showed 47 patients admitted across the night. 14 discharged before 9 o'clock. 14 more between 9 and 11. 23 remaining. She wrote the morning summary in the log's back margin. Total admissions, total discharges, current census, supply status as of 11:40. It was the same summary format she used at the end of every intake period, adjusted in its figures, but not in its structure. The structure was the same because the structure was the point. A record that changed its format based on the severity of the events it documented was a record that could not be reliably compared across periods, and a record that could not be compared was less useful than one that could. She completed the summary and set the quill on its rest. Outside the ward's windows, the morning had settled into itself. The light was stronger now, the flat early quality replaced by something more definite. The castle was making sounds, not the irregular percussion of the night, but the sounds it made when people were moving through it. Footsteps in corridors, distant voices. Once, briefly, what might have been a door closing firmly somewhere on a lower floor. She noted none of this in the log. It was not admissions information. She pulled the administrative task list towards her and drew the completion line through item 7. Final bed check and morning notation. All 7 items had completion lines through them. She filed the list. She picked up the admissions log and carried it to the shelf beside the medicine cabinet, where it was stored between active periods. She slid it into its place. Then she turned and looked at the ward From that position, which was a vantage she rarely used, further from the desk, closer to the door, a different angle on the beds and the pallets and the occupied spaces. 23 patients, correct treatments administered, records current and complete, supplies assessed and reorder submitted, briefing note filed, discharge schedule established. The ward was functioning. She went to begin the afternoon's work.